The high ground is chosen first, and everything else follows from it. Medieval builders read terrain the way a farmer reads soil, looking for a spur above a river crossing or a hill that forces a road to bend around it. This citadel stands where the land already does half the work of defending it. Steep-sided, approached by a single switchback, its gatehouse built up into the strongest point on the whole circuit. The moat and the lowered bridge answer a simple problem. A wall has to open somewhere, and wherever it opens is where it can be broken, so the opening is made heavier than anything around it. Inside, the great hall holds the center. In the fortresses this one recalls, the hall served as courtroom and counting house, feast hall and barracks at once. Retainers slept among the rushes once the trestle tables were carried out, and the smoke of the central hearth found its way up through the rafters. Beyond the walls, terraced fields fall away toward forest and mountain, their old boundaries still marked by weathered cairns. A fortress consumes far more than it produces. The valley below feeds it, and the garrison that holds it was drilled, paid and buried within sight of those fields. The weapon is a shaft of ash 4 to 6 meters long, 13 to 20 feet, tipped with a narrow iron head, and on its own closed to useless. Set in a block of several hundred men, it reshaped European warfare. Through the 14th century, Flemish townsmen and Swiss levies proved what the mounted nobility had been slow to accept. A horse will not run onto a hedge of points, and a rider who cannot close cannot fight. The stance carries the whole craft. The butt end is wedged against the instep or driven into the ground, the body low, the shaft held level as the charge comes on. The front rank has no option to give way, since the ranks behind stand too close to allow it, which is the formation working as intended. Men like this were raised by levy, drilled through a season, armored in whatever the town could afford, scarred leather and an open steel cap. Their names go onto the barracks wall in the same hand as the men who held that ground before them. 10 years and several campaigns on, the same soldier carries a different weapon. A halberd runs shorter than a pike, roughly 2 meters, 6 or 7 feet, and does 3 jobs at once. The axe blade splits shield and helmet. The spike above it still refuses a horse. The hook on the reverse catches an arm, a saddle girth or a rider's harness, and drags him down into the press, where plate protects a man much less than it appears to. Because the halberd belongs to the moment a formation comes apart, it was handed to the men least likely to run. Swiss and German companies posted them at the corners of the square and around the standard. The work paid well and traveled. A career of it might be spent under 4 or 5 banners, none of them a man's own. The weapon outlasted its battlefield use and became a mark of rank. Sergeants carried halberds into the 18th century, and ceremonial guards carry them still, which is how one ends up leaned on at a gatehouse at midnight. A war bow of this kind is less a marksman's instrument than a lifetime of accumulated labor. Bows recovered from the wreck of the Mary Rose draw weights between roughly 45 and 80 kilograms, 100 to 180 pounds, well beyond what an untrained adult can manage. The archers who used them were shaped by them. Their skeletons show thickened arm bone and twisted spines built up over decades of drawing. That kind of body was produced by law and habit rather than by any academy. Statutes required practice at the butts on holidays, and rival amusements were banned to protect the hours set aside for it. Rate mattered more than precision. A trained man loosed 10 or 12 arrows a minute into an area rather than at an individual, and the second shaft left the string before the first had landed. The limit was never the archer. Arrows arrived in sheaves of 24, were gone in 2 minutes of shooting, and were counted every evening against the length of the siege. What separates a veteran from the ranks below him is repeatability rather than strength. The draw ends at the same anchor point on the jaw every time. The release is clean rather than plucked, and the body stays still through the loose, since any movement before the arrow clears the bow is written into its flight. Range is read off the ground, wind off the banners, and a moving target is led rather than followed, the arrow sent to where the target will be. Men who could do that reliably were retained by name. Mounted archers in English retinues drew roughly twice the daily wage of a foot soldier, and served under written indenture, like the professionals they were. The bow itself was personal property, built to one man's draw length and weight. Fine examples were reinforced with horn, bound with sinew, inlaid, and kept cased and greased against damp. A bow of that quality outlasts the campaigns recorded along its limb, and it will never shoot properly for anyone else. An eagle's head, beak and forelegs joined to the hindquarters and tail of a lion. The composite is among the oldest in the human record, worked in Elam and Egypt more than 4,000 years ago, carried into Minoan, Crete, and set into the stonework of Achaemenid Persia, where it still stares out of the reliefs at Persepolis. Greek writers placed griffins in the far northeast, beyond the Scythian steppe, where they were said to guard gold and to fight the one-eyed Arimaspians for it. Herodotus repeated the account at arm's length and did not believe it. One modern proposal traces the tradition to beaked, four-legged fossil skeletons weathering out of the ground along those same gold roots. The behavior follows the parts. It hunts from height, folding into a stoop and flaring its wings at the last moment to bring the talons forward, killing with the feet as raptors do. Between hunts it does what large cats do. It holds a high perch, preens, and lets its tail move while the rest of it stays still. The heavier birds are marked by their plumage before anything else. Barred adult feathering replaces the streaked pattern of a young animal, and by the time the bars have come in clean, the wingspan has roughly doubled. A climb like this one runs nearly vertical and costs the animal everything it has. It is paid for out of the stoop, the speed of the dive traded back for height. The jesses are the human addition. Leather straps fitted above the foot are the oldest piece of falconry equipment there is, and among European nobility they were finished to match the owner, with silver varvels engraved with a coat of arms, so that a lost bird could be identified and claimed. Rank was legible in the bird itself. A 15th century English list assigned species by station, eagle to emperor and peregrine to earl, an arrangement kept more faithfully in books than in the field. An animal this size on the highest tower at dawn is doing two things: watching the valley and being seen to watch it. The sword is the expensive part of this man. A serviceable blade cost several months of a laborer's wages, and the breastplate and open helm behind it cost a good deal more, which is why the sword survives in art as a marker of standing long after it stopped deciding battles. The technique came out of books. Europe's fencing manuals begin around 1,300 with an illustrated sword and buckler treatise, and run on through Fior de Liberi and the Liechtenauer tradition, and they agree on a principle visible here. Defense and attack occupy a single motion. The shield takes the descending blow at the same moment the blade goes out low to the flank, because a parry that finishes before the counter begins has handed the opponent a free tempo. The other half of the trade happened before dawn. Arms were blessed, vigils kept, and men knelt in near-empty chapels ahead of the muster, a habit repeated so consistently across medieval Europe that its absence from a chronicle draws more attention than its presence. By the 12th century, the two occupations had been formally combined. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers and later the Teutonic Knights, took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then rode to war under them, an arrangement argued into acceptance by Bernard of Clairvaux, and never entirely comfortable for anybody. Those orders became landholders, bankers, and nurses, as well as soldiers. The great hospital in Jerusalem was run by men from the same institution that fielded heavy cavalry. The surcoat over the plate began as practical kit in the Levanten sun, keeping metal cool and mail dry, and became the surface on which a man's marks were carried. Sigils cut into the armor itself served the same purpose. The gesture at the end of the day belongs to the same world. A sword driven point down into the earth stands as a cross, and a knight keeping vigil over a dead companion in that posture appears in manuscript illumination and on tomb effigies for 300 years. Fighting orders of unarmed religious appear independently in several traditions. Shaolin monasteries in China sent monk soldiers against pirate raids on the Ming coast in the 1550s. Japan had its Sohei, armed temple communities powerful enough to intimidate a capital. Korean monks under the master Hujeong raised an army during the Japanese invasions of the 1590s. In each case, the martial practice grew inside a devotional one rather than beside it. The unarmed emphasis has a mundane origin. Monastic rules discouraged edged weapons, so these traditions built around the staff, the open hand, and the body's own weight. A palm heel strike thrown out of a turn puts the mass of the whole body behind the hand, and the turn, not the arm, is where the force comes from. The cord of beads is older and more widely shared than any of it. 108 beads on a mala, a knotted wool cord in an Orthodox cell, a rosary in a Latin one, all of them counting repetitions, so the mind repeating them need not keep the tally. The word is a historical one before it is a description of temperament. It names a faction in 1st century Judea that pushed an occupied province into open revolt, and it has been applied ever since to the point at which devotion stops observing and starts acting. The practice here is the cloisters, turned outward. The breathing is the visible part. Light gathers and fades in the palms at the pace of a slow inhalation and a slower release, which is roughly what a lifetime of counted repetitions produces in a body, a metronome that no longer needs the beads to keep time. The ornament is worth noticing, because it does not match the robes. A heavy iron torque is a far older object than the gold-trimmed vestments worn over it, the kind of neck ring worn by Iron Age warriors from Gaul to the Danube and buried with their dead. Objects like that tend to survive a change of religion. They are kept and re-explained by each institution that inherits them. The charge works because of the way the lance is held. Couched rigid beneath the arm and braced back against the body, it stops being a thrusting weapon and becomes a means of delivering the combined mass of horse, armor, and rider into a single point. The technique depended on the deep saddle with its high cantle, which keeps the rider from being driven off the back of the horse at the instant of impact. How much the stirrup contributed is still argued over. The animal is the greater expense. A trained war horse cost as much as a small estate, and a man who could afford one generally kept several, riding lesser mounts on the road and saving the destrier for the charge itself. The pennon at the lance head carried identity and rank together. A knight bachelor flew a tapering pennon, and promotion to banneret was performed in the field by cutting the tails from it, leaving a square banner, and a man entitled to lead others under it. The title carried a legal meaning. Under trial by battle, a case could be settled by combat between hired champions standing in for the parties, men who fought other people's lawsuits for a fee, and were kept on retainer by monasteries and towns that held land worth defending, and no wish to defend it personally. England did not remove the procedure from its statute books until 1819. Where the rest of the trade was practiced was the tournament. The joust rewarded a narrow and endlessly repeatable skill. The older melee ran closer to a battle, and men were ransomed out of it much as they were out of a war. The horse absorbs the investment. Full barding, plate for the head, neck, chest, and hindquarters, could weigh as much as the rider's own harness, and the caparison laid over it carried the colors. A man going over that fitting by lantern light after a field is maintaining the most expensive thing he owns, and the only part of the arrangement that has to be persuaded. The figure is old and widely shared. A winged human, armed, standing between a threshold and whatever waits on the far side of it. Assyrian palace gateways were guarded by winged genii carved at scale, and the Greek word behind the English one means, plainly, a messenger. The wings arrived late in the tradition this image belongs to. Early Christian art showed these beings without them, as young men in plain robes. The feathered pair comes from the winged victory of Greek and Roman sculpture, absorbed into the iconography during the 4th century and fixed there ever since. The burning sword is later still, an image drawn from the guarded gate of Eden and carried into painting as the mark of the warrior type rather than the messenger. Artists have been consistent about temperament. The face stays calm and the posture unhurried even mid-strike, and the being standing on a spire with its wings folded and its sword lowered is understood to be doing the same work as the one descending through the cloud. Rank is shown by wings. Nothing about a second pair helps the thing fly. The convention comes out of visionary literature, where the beings closest to the center are described with 6 wings, or with 4 faces, and painters turned those descriptions into a hierarchy that could be counted at a glance. 4 wings on a figure in gold-chased armor is a statement about position rather than about flight. The idea of ordered ranks among such beings is itself a late systematization. A 6th century treatise circulated under a borrowed name arranged them into 9 orders in 3 groups, and that scheme governed European art for the next 1,000 years. Though the older traditions it drew on disagreed with one another and went on disagreeing. The sword-bearing type is a commander in the imagery, set at the head of a host. What painters give it consistently is restraint. Enormous force held. The light along the blade fades rather than snapping off. The wings fold and the figure goes back to standing in a doorway. Nothing here was quarried. The stronghold was grown, and the difference shows. No straight line, no repeated span, every arch the shape the tree happened to take. Sacred woods were the ordinary form of the holy place across northern Europe long before stone temples arrived. Tacitus wrote that the Germanic peoples thought it improper to shut gods inside walls, and kept groves instead. The Celtic word for such a place, Nemeton, survives in ground names from Spain to Galatia, which is a long way for one idea to travel. Inside, the hall is a hollow rather than a room. Old trees rot from the middle outward while the living growth stays thin under the bark, so a trunk wide enough becomes its own chamber, and people have sheltered and held court inside them ever since there were trees old enough to oblige. Bark takes an inscription and carries it upward and outward, distorting it a little more each season. Beyond the roots, the land does the defending. Standing stones ring the outer glades along the old boundary. The rivers run silver under low fog, and the deer trails are the only roads. A wood is a poor place to bring an army through, and everyone who has tried it has said so afterwards. Man to the waist and horse below it, joined at the shoulder without a seam. The Greeks put them in Thessaly, with manners to match. Wine taken badly, guests mishandled, a wedding at which the whole species disgraced itself. The brawl that followed was carved onto the metopes of the Parthenon and the temple of Zeus at Olympia, so the same warning stood on Greece's two most public buildings. The bow belongs to the type. Drawing at full stretch out of a rearing body is a problem of balance rather than strength, since the archer and the platform are one animal with nothing to brace against but himself. When the sky was divided up, one of the 12 figures along the zodiac was a centaur with a bow. One story stayed attached to a name. Nessus, ferrying a hero's wife across a river, was shot for what he attempted there, and the blood he gave her as a love charm killed her husband years later. A sentry keeping to the tree line has reasons the stories keep supplying. The crest carries the rank. Greek helmets took horsehair crests set high, and Roman practice made the purpose explicit. A centurion wore his crossways so his men could find him in a press. Bronze over the flanks continues the argument at greater cost. Armor on the animal's body is heavy and slow, and it goes to the one meant to be looked at. The wise exception has a name. Chiron was of separate descent, and everything the rest of them were not. Physician, astronomer, musician, and tutor to Achilles, Jason, and Asclepius. The Greek line of medicine runs back through him, which puts the origin of the healing art with an animal from the mountains rather than a man from a city. His end is why he is remembered. Struck by a poisoned arrow and immortal, he could not die of the wound, so he traded his immortality to Prometheus and was set among the stars. A commander laying a dead companion's broken bow on a shrine works in that older tradition, where leading includes the accounting afterwards. Dwarves enter the record as makers long before they enter it as fighters. The Norse sources hand them the best objects in the world: the spear that never misses, the hammer that always returns, the ship that folds into a pocket. The poetic Edda stops mid-poem to list more than 60 by name, a catalog later readers quietly mined for names of their own. The working folklore is a mining one, and it is not friendly. German miners knew the Bergmannalin, small figures met underground who might show a good seam or bring the roof down. 2 of them are on the periodic table. Cobalt takes its name from the kobold, blamed for ore that poisoned smelters and yielded no copper, and nickel from Kupfernickel, Old Nick's copper, which behaved the same. Height arrived late. The early sources say little about size and much about skill, and the smith is held at arm's length, useful and slightly feared, working alone at the edge of the settlement because that is where the fire is permitted to be. The same hands, a harder problem. A hammer is the answer to plate. Once armor was good enough to turn an edge, European weapons went back to percussion, and the war hammer and the beaked poleaxe were built to defeat a harness by transmitting the blow through it rather than cutting it. A man inside good plate is rarely opened. He is shaken until something inside him stops. The marks on the head are not ornament alone. Inscribed weapons run through the record, from the runic spear shafts in the Danish bog deposits to the Ulfbert blades of the 9th century, and the words tend to be short. A maker, an owner, a wish for luck. The horns are the anachronism. Nothing like them was ever Norse. The genuine horned helmets, the pair from Vixo in Denmark, are Bronze Age ceremonial objects 3,000 years old, and the popular version was reinvented for the opera house in the 19th century. It has proved impossible to retire. A hall hung with ancestral standards keeps whichever ancestors it prefers. The elves of the older folklore are not the later kind. Old English Aelf and Old Norse Alfr name beings that were beautiful, powerful, and mainly a problem. They caused illness. Anglo-Saxon medical texts prescribe against complaints laid at their door, and the standard explanation for livestock that sickened in the field without a mark on it was elf shot, an arrow nobody had seen arrive. The arrows were sometimes found. Neolithic flint arrowheads turning up in plowed ground were collected as elf bolts and worn as charms against the very affliction they were thought to cause. That an archer sits at the center of this tradition is no accident of imagery. The shot that comes from nowhere is the whole of the original complaint. The word settled into ordinary use and stayed there. English names carry it still. Aelfred meaning elf counsel and Aelfwine elf friend, chosen by parents who wanted the association working for them. Something sitting out at dusk on a high branch belongs to that older reading, where the danger and the beauty were never separated out. The elder of the line comes with the ceremony attached. The Alfr received sacrifice in their own right. The alphablot was held farm by farm in late autumn, run by the women of the household, and closed to outsiders on principle. One traveler's account survives. A Norwegian poet crossing Sweden around the year 1018 was turned away from door after door, because the rite was in progress, and he was the wrong sort of stranger. Assembly out of doors is the northern habit generally. Law was spoken aloud from a marked place, a ring of stones or a rock above a plain, by a man whose office was to hold all of it in memory and recite a third each year. Nothing was posted. Everything was heard in the open, at a spot every household could name. The second quiver is the professional detail. Arrows were carried sorted rather than mixed, by head and by weight, so what a shooter trusts at long range stays apart from what he can afford to waste. The winged horse arrives in Greek myth fully grown, out of the neck of the Gorgon at the moment Perseus takes her head. The name is usually connected with the word for a spring, and springs are what it produces. Striking Mount Helicon with a hoof, it opened Hippocrene, the horse's fountain, whose water was where poets were said to get their material. Wings and inspiration have been fastened together ever since, mostly by people who wanted the metaphor. Riding it required equipment. Bellerophon could not get near the animal until Athena gave him a golden bridle, and with it he killed the chimera from above, which is the earliest recorded advantage of holding altitude. He then attempted to ride up to Olympus. Zeus sent a gadfly, the horse bucked, and the man fell the whole distance back. The animal was never blamed for it. It went on alone and was given the work of carrying thunderbolts. Corinth struck it on its coinage for 3 centuries, in such quantity that the coins were known simply as colts. What became of it is written across the autumn sky. Pegasus is one of the 48 constellations Ptolemy listed in the 2nd century, and its brightest stars form the Great Square, 4 corners plain enough to find everything else by. One corner was claimed by 2 constellations at once for centuries, shared with Andromeda, until the boundaries were ruled and Andromeda kept it. The figure is upside down and cut in half. The old charts show only the forequarters, running head downward across the meridian, and the constellation has no hindquarters at all, which nobody in 2,000 years has thought worth correcting. At ground level, the useful fact is simpler. A horse's coat is not white. Gray horses are born dark and pale with age as the pigment withdraws from the hair, so an old one carries almost no color of its own and takes whatever light the sky offers. An animal standing on a spire at midnight is doing what horses do at night, which is sleep in short turns, with one of them always watching. Tree guardians appear wherever people live beside trees older than their buildings. Greek dryads were bound to a single trunk and died when it fell, which made cutting one a matter for the gods, not the estate. The foliate head, a face with leaves coming out of it, is cut into European churches in the thousands by masons who left no record of its meaning. Felling a great tree was a public act, and used as one. Boniface took an axe to the oak of Thor at Jasmer in front of the people who venerated it, and Charlemagne destroyed the Irminsul, a wooden pillar the Saxons held sacred, as the opening move of a conquest. In both cases, the tree was chosen because the tree was the institution. The biology is stranger than the folklore. Most of a large tree is dead. The living growth is a thin sleeve under the bark, and the heartwood at the center is finished timber carrying weight and nothing else. Anything moving on that plan would move slowly, and have little reason to hurry. Age changes what the thing is for. The old rule gives an oak 300 years growing, 300 resting, and 300 declining, and the declining centuries are the productive ones for everything else. A hollowing trunk houses owls, bats, and beetles. A fallen one becomes a nurse log, and a generation of seedlings roots into the rot and grows up along its length. People learn to take the wood without taking the tree. Coppicing cuts a stool back to the ground and harvests the regrowth on a cycle of years. Pollarding does the same above the reach of livestock. Stools handled this way have been cropped for 1,000 years, so the oldest living things in some English woods are the ones cut most often. The long view was occasionally policy. Oaks were planted in the 18th century for warships to be laid down 120 years later, by men with no prospect of seeing a plank of it. By the time the timber was ready, the navy had gone over to iron. The unicorn entered European writing as a report rather than a myth. C. Ctesias, a Greek physician at the Persian court around 400 BC, described a wild ass in India whose horn, worked into a cup, neutralized poison. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures rendered an unidentified wild ox as Monoceros, which put a one-horned beast into the Bible and ended the argument. The bestiaries fixed two scenes. In the first, it dips its horn into a poisoned pool to purify the water so other beasts can drink, which is why it is so often drawn at water's edge. In the second, no hunter can take it, and it goes quiet only in a maiden's lap, where it is caught. The trade underneath was expensive. Narwhal tusks came south out of the Arctic and sold as alicorn at many times their weight in gold. Denmark built a coronation throne from them, and the horn kept at Windsor was valued at £10,000 in the 16th century. The market held as long as nobody went north to check. The armored version belongs to heraldry rather than the bestiary. Scotland took the unicorn into its royal arms in the 15th century and has kept it there, opposite the English lion on the United Shield, always drawn in a chain. The chain is not ornament. A free unicorn was understood to be dangerous, so the herald's compromise was to display the most formidable animal available and then show it held. The horn in that imagery is a lance carried level and used at the gallop. The object the imagery was built on is a tooth. A narwhal's tusk is an overgrown left canine that erupts through the lip and spirals in nearly every animal to the left. Sheathing it in engraved silver is borrowed from the treasury. Relics and curiosities were mounted in worked metal, so they could be shown and valued without being touched, and the mount routinely cost more than the thing inside. An animal standing over a fallen banner in the last of the light has been given the same treatment as a saint's finger bone. The dragon is a large enough subject to be taken on its own terms, and it is taken on them elsewhere. What matters at this end of the forest is the European pattern in its plainest form. A great winged serpent, settled on something valuable in a hollow, going nowhere for a very long time. The word explains the behavior. Greek draken comes from a verb meaning to see sharply, so the creature is named for its stare rather than for its fire or its size. It is the thing that watches. The temperament follows from that, because a watcher with a horde has one bad day in its whole life, and every story about it is about that day. Beowulf sets out the mechanism exactly. 300 years of quiet end when a single cup is lifted from the barrow, and the animal counts the horde, finds the gap, and burns the country for it. A green one coiled around a clutch of pale eggs under a fallen trunk is the same arrangement with the valuables changed. Gold is the older half of the pairing. Treasure and the beast on it are bound so tightly in northern writing that a hoard is called the dragon's bed. The archaeology keeps turning up the other half. Hoards put into the ground in a hurry and never lifted, at Hoxne, in Staffordshire, in 100 smaller finds, each the record of somebody who meant to come back. Not every tradition made the animal a thief. In China, the dragon brings rain and stands for the emperor, a creature of rivers and weather rather than fire and theft. The two share nothing but the shape, and the shape is what traveled. The one on the tower is doing an old job. Roman cavalry carried a Draco, a bronze dragon's head on a pole with a fabric tube that filled at the gallop and howled, taken from the steppe peoples they fought. It showed where the line stood and was heard doing it. A gilded animal on a ruined watchtower, visible from the whole valley, is that instrument at a larger scale. Height is the point of a building like this, and defense has almost nothing to do with it. It is raised where the sightlines are, on a crag that clears the weather and the tree line together, and everything awkward about it follows from that one decision. The great observatories were sited on the same reasoning, and paid the same price. Ulugh Beg's instrument at Samarkand was sunk into a hillside because no timber frame could hold something that size steady. Tycho Brahe built his house on an exposed island, found the wind shaking his quadrants too badly to read, and put the second observatory underground. Height buys distance and takes back stillness. Inside, the model of the heavens holds the center. Geared machines of this kind are far older than the name for them. The mechanism recovered from a wreck-off Antikythera was tracking lunar and solar cycles in bronze more than 2,000 years ago. The word orrery is barely 3 centuries old and commemorates a patron rather than a maker, an earl who was presented with one of the first. Outside, a single trail works up the ridge between standing stones older than any of it. Nothing about the approach is convenient, and that is not an accident either. Nearly everything in a bestiary of this kind is old. This one is not. The gremlin was invented by aircrew and aircraft mechanics, apparently in the Royal Air Force of the 1920s, and it is in print by the end of that decade. It named the class of fault that has no findable cause. The instrument that reads true on the bench and lies in the air, the fitting that works loose on a machine nobody has touched. Roald Dahl, a fighter pilot before he was a writer, put the creature into a book in 1943, and Disney bought the film rights, which is how a piece of workshop slang became a household word inside 20 years. The older versions of the habit are identical. Ship's carpenters blamed the clabberman. Printers kept a devil in the composing room to account for the errors that survived 3 readings. A trade that depends on precision tends to grow a small, malicious creature to carry the blame for the last few percent. The ranks came quickly. Within a few years of the creature's appearance, the squadrons had built out a whole population. Females, young, and specialists for particular kinds of sabotage, with names that varied from station to station and were argued over like real taxonomy. Doll's telling gave the female a name of her own and called the children widgets. The weapon is a separate history and a much older one. Handheld guns arrive in Europe in the 14th century as a tube on a stick, fired by touching a hot wire to a hole in the barrel and aimed in the loosest sense of the word. They were slow, wildly inaccurate, and about as dangerous behind as in front, since a barrel forged from whooped iron could open along its seams under a heavy charge. What they had over a bow was that the man holding one did not need 10 years of training to be useful. Something assembled in a workshop annex out of scavenged parts fails in exactly those ways, and gets built again the same afternoon. The word describes plumbing. A gargoyle is a waterspout, cut to throw roof water clear of the wall, and it shares a root with gargle and with the French for throat. Rain running straight down a masonry face gets into the mortar, freezes, and takes the wall apart over a century or two, so the water is carried out along a stone tongue and dropped into open air. Carved figures with no spout in them are properly grotesques. The celebrated ones ringing the balustrade at Notre Dame belong to a 19th century restoration and have never carried a drop of water. The legend behind the name is from Rouen. A dragon called the Gargoyle came up out of the Seine and was subdued by the city's bishop, and its head was fixed to the wall of the church, which gets offered as the reason such faces appear on churches at all. The story arrived long after the practice did. A figure like this spends most of its existence weathering quietly and being mistaken for the statuary beside it. The material is real, and it is not stone in the ordinary sense. Obsidian is lava cooled too fast for crystals to form, a natural glass, which is why it fractures in smooth curved surfaces and takes an edge finer than anything that can be ground onto steel. Blades struck from it are sharp at a scale of a few molecules, sharp enough that surgeons have occasionally used them. Mesoamerican workshops turned out obsidian edges by the thousand and set them into wooden swords, and the same volcanic glass, polished flat, served as a mirror. Why carved monsters were put on churches at all was disputed at the time. One argument made them wards, ugly enough to turn back whatever was worse. Another treated them as sermon material for people who could not read. A 12th century abbot complained in writing about the ridiculous monstrosities crowding his order's cloisters, and demanded to know what they were doing in a house of prayer, which establishes both that they were everywhere and that nobody had a settled answer. The tradition is Jewish, and the word appears once in Scripture, in a psalm, meaning something unformed and not yet finished. Rabbinic writing took it up for a body made and animated without a soul, and the Talmud has a sage creating a man who cannot speak. What animates it in the later stories is always a written thing. A name of God on a slip of parchment set into the mouth, or a word cut into the forehead. In the best-known version, that word is truth, and striking out its first letter leaves the word dead, which is how the thing is stopped. Clay is not incidental. The first man in the same tradition is shaped from earth and given breath, and every golem story is a commentary on that one, performed by somebody with no authority to perform it. A figure standing in an overgrown courtyard, with its sigil burned down to an ember, sits between those two conditions, and stays there. The famous version belongs to Prague, to a 16th century rabbi, and to a story that cannot be traced back further than the 19th. In it the golem is made to guard the community, grows too strong to direct, and is shut down and left in the loft of the synagogue on the understanding that it can be woken if needed. Every telling ends the same way. The maidservant is easy to begin and hard to finish, and the maker is judged on the second part rather than the first. Iron shifts the terms a little. Across Northern European folk belief, iron is protective in itself. Nails driven over a door, a blade laid under a threshold, the metal the other kind of creature will not come near. A guardian forged out of it is warded twice. It is also the material that rots. Rust blooming at the rivets of something built to outlast its maker is the ordinary end of the arrangement, and it arrives on schedule. The word is a loan, and it never lost its accent. Magos came into Greek from Old Persian, where it named a priestly class among the Medes with charge of ritual and the reading of dreams. Greek writers used it for foreign right, and it carried both senses for centuries afterwards. A learned specialist, and somebody doing something not quite licit in a language nobody local could check. The medieval version was a scholar before he was anything else. Astronomy and astrology were a single subject, and the man calculating a planetary position for a horoscope was using the best mathematics available anywhere in Europe. Reputations then attached themselves to whoever read most widely, wanted or not. Two of the 13th century's most careful natural philosophers were remembered within a lifetime as sorcerers. One of them credited with a talking brass head he never once mentioned. The work itself looks like the work here. A desk, a borrowed manuscript, and hours spent on a formula written in a difficult language. What separated the higher grade from the village practitioner was a library. The learned magic of the Renaissance was a reading culture built on a body of Greek and Egyptian texts attributed to a figure called Hermes the Thrice Great, and believed to predate Moses. Their translator broke off work on Plato to finish them first, on the grounds that they were older and therefore nearer the source. A century and a half later, a philologist dated them by their vocabulary to the early Christian centuries, and the foundation under the whole edifice moved. The libraries were real even where the pedigree was not. One English scholar of the 16th century assembled 3,000 or 4,000 volumes at his house on the Thames, more than either university held, and lost most of it while he was abroad. Silence is the working condition of the trade. Sorting a wall of drifting pages with a gesture is a fantasy about the one part of the work that never got any faster. The djinn are a category of being rather than a class of servant. The word comes from an Arabic root for concealment, and in pre-Islamic Arabia they were understood as the hidden inhabitants of the desert and of ruined places. Islamic tradition kept them and defined them. Created from smokeless fire as humans were created from clay, invisible by default, possessed of free will and answerable for it, living in communities with their own believers and their own unbelievers. A chapter of the Quran is named after them. None of that describes a wish. The servant of the lamp is a European graft. The Aladdin story is absent from the older Arabic manuscripts of the 1001 Nights, and enters through the French translation of the early 18th century, taken down from a Syrian traveler who told it to the translator in Paris. The lamp has a different root. Legends of Solomon have him binding rebellious jinn under his seal and shutting them into brass vessels, which is how a stoppered container gets into the tradition at all. The tradition ranks them. The most powerful and least tractable are the Marid, below them the Ifrit, and beneath that a range of lesser and more local kinds, including the one that reached English as the ghoul. The categories are not tidy, and the sources disagree with each other, which is what a living body of belief looks like from outside it. They are held to be present rather than legendary. A dust devil crossing open ground is a djinn passing through. Illness and disturbance of the mind have long been attributed to them, with an established practice of recitation for driving them back out. Jurists have argued in earnest over whether a marriage between a human and a djinn would be valid, which is not a question anybody bothers to ask about a folk tale. The weather in the imagery follows from the material. A being made of fire and moving the way smoke moves is going to be drawn coiling out of a storm, and the storm is going to look like it is under instruction. Naga is Sanskrit for serpent, and the beings the word names run through Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain tradition, and across the whole of South and Southeast Asia. They belong to water, rivers, lakes, wells, the rain, and a subterranean world of their own beneath the earth. They hold treasure, and they hold knowledge. One account has the founding texts of a school of Buddhist philosophy kept safe by Nagas for centuries, until a teacher was judged fit to be given them back. They are not dragons in the Western sense, and the comparison misleads more than it explains. How the serpent beings of Asia relate to the winged reptiles of European heraldry is a long subject, and belongs to a longer account than this one. Their standing is high. A serpent king sheltered the Buddha through 7 days of storm by raising its hood above him, an episode carved and cast more often than almost any other, and serpents are still offered milk and flowers on a fixed day of the year. The hood is anatomy before it is ornament. A cobra spreads it by swinging elongated ribs in the neck outward until the loose skin is pulled flat, and the display collapses the moment the animal relaxes. Sculptors count the heads above it: 1, 5, 7, 9, always odd, with 7 the standard along the causeways at Angkor. Royalty runs all through the tradition. Serpent kings and queens hold courts and territories, and more than one Southeast Asian dynasty traced its founding to a marriage between an incoming man and a Naga princess, which settled a claim to the land in a single sentence. Kingship and water rights were the same argument conducted twice. Temple architecture puts these figures at thresholds. A Naga balustrade runs the length of a bridge or a stair, so that anyone approaching the sanctuary walks between 2 serpent bodies, with the hoods raised at the near end. A crowned figure holding perfectly still in a sunken chamber occupies the position the carvings assign her. Giants are the most widespread of the folk figures and the least organized. The Norse Jotnar are not simply large people. They are an older order that existed before the gods and were held off rather than defeated, and the world in that cosmology is built out of the body of one of them. Elsewhere, giants are an explanation for the ground itself. A causeway of hexagonal basalt columns on the Irish coast is credited to one, and the same instinct assigns standing stones, stranded boulders, and oddly placed hills to somebody enormous who put them there. The bones helped. Fossil elephant and whale material turned up across Europe for centuries and was displayed in churches as the remains of giants, and given what was known at the time, the identification was a reasonable one. What the stories actually dwell on is domestic. Giants in folk tale keep houses, quarrel with their wives, mend their own gear, and eat badly, all of it at the wrong scale, and the size is mostly there to make the smallness visible. Titan is not a synonym for giant, whatever the modern usage suggests. In Greek genealogy, the Titans are one specific generation, 12 children of sky and earth, among them Kronos, Rhea, Ocean, Memory, and the father of Prometheus. They ruled before the Olympians, lost a 10-year war to them, and were shut away below the world. The giants are a separate race and fought a separate war, and ancient art was already confusing the two. What the elder generation is credited with is making rather than fighting. One of them shaped the first humans out of clay and was punished for what he handed them afterwards. Another holds up the sky. The sun, the moon, and the dawn all belong to that line. The lightning is the wrong attribute, strictly speaking. The thunderbolt belongs to the god who deposed them and was forged for that war. Later painting handed it back, and the word itself has since flattened into a term for anything merely very large. Every underworld begins somewhere real. The oldest ones on record are not furnaces at all. The Mesopotamian house of dust where the dead sit in the dark, the gray Hades of Homer, dim and joyless rather than burning. Fire enters late, and it enters through geology. Ancient writers cited the doors to the world below wherever the ground was already smoking. The Phlegrean fields west of Naples take their name from a Greek verb meaning to blaze. The sulfur crater at their center still vents steam, and classical authors pointed at it as an entrance. Brimstone is only the Old English name for the same mineral, the stone that burns. The hall is the giveaway. A wilderness needs no thrones. What medieval and early modern writers built instead was a court, with ranks, seats, offices, and a chain of command borrowed wholesale from the chanceries they lived under, which is why an infernal hall in painting reads as a throne room with the light turned down and the windows taken out. Dante's is the most surveyed of all of them, a funnel of 9 descending circles, sorted and numbered like a ledger. And at the very bottom, where every picture since has expected fire, he put ice. The word began as a gardener's. Old English impa meant a young shoot or a graft, the slip of new wood set into older stock, and to imp was to splice one onto the other. Falconers kept the sense longest. To imp a hawk is still to graft a fresh feather into a broken one. From graft the word slid to offspring, then to the small offspring of something worse, and finally shrank to what it names here, a minor nuisance with a talent for fire. Scale is the entire characterization. Stone carvers understood that. The best known of these figures sits high in the angel choir at Lincoln, a squat cross-legged grotesque a few handspans tall, cut in the 13th century and given its story only in the 19th. When a guidebook explained that the thing had been turned to stone for making mischief among the angels. Nothing in the pose is dignified. It springs, it grins, it perches out of reach, and its fire is a handheld quantity, thrown once and gone. The next size up in the same imagery is a servant, and the name says so. Familiaris in Latin means of the household, a member of the domestic staff, and a familiar spirit was described by the people who wrote about such things as a retainer rather than a power. The idea is oddly local. In the English and Scottish witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, the accused were said to keep small animals, a cat, a toad, a hare, a mouse, each with a homely name. The Chelmsford trial of 1566 recorded a white spotted cat called Sathan, and Matthew Hopkins's pamphlet of 1647 illustrated a row of them with names like Pewhacket and Vinegar Tom. Continental trials, working from a different legal theory, barely mention such creatures at all. The traced circle belongs to a separate literature, the manuscript grimoires, where the ring and its signs protect whoever is doing the summoning. In the pictures, that person is always absent, and the servant is drawn listening to a voice from outside the frame. The names arrive in medieval Europe already ancient and already paired, inherited from older scripture and repeated for centuries with no agreement about what they had ever meant. A king, a country, a people, or a pair of monsters? Legend settled the question by walling them up. In the Alexander romance, the sprawling invented life of Alexander that circulated in Syriac, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and a dozen other languages, the conqueror shuts a barbarous nation behind an iron gate in the mountains of the Caucasus, to stay there until the end of things. Mapmakers took him at his word. The Hereford Mappa Mundi and the Great Ebstorf map both pen the pair into the far northeastern corner of the world, behind a wall, waiting. The creature drawn out of all that is a mob animal rather than an individual. It runs knuckled forward and low, useful in numbers, armed with whatever came to hand. It travels in a horde because the legend never gave it a name of its own, only a plural. Taken apart, the two names go the other way, toward giants. English tradition fused the two names into one, and Gog-Magog appears in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain around 1136 as the last of a race holding the island, wrestled off a cliff at Plymouth by a Trojan named Corinius. Plymouth kept two figures cut into the turf of the Hoe for generations afterwards, and the borough accounts record payments for scouring them clean again, until a citadel was built over the ground. London kept its giants standing. Carved effigies of Gog and Magog have been carried in the Lord Mayor's procession since at least the 15th century, and the present pair, made in 1953 to replace figures burnt in the Blitz, stand in the Guildhall still. The swollen throat is invention, though not an unfounded one. A stored reservoir discharged at range is ordinary enough in nature. The bombardier beetle, the spitting cobra, the Fulmar chick that vomits oil at anything leaning over the nest. Britain reports more of these than any other apparition. East Anglia calls its black dog Shuck, from Old English Skucka, a demon, and a pamphlet of 1577 describes one running the length of the church at Bungay during a thunderstorm and killing two parishioners at prayer. The scorch marks on the door at Blithburgh, a few miles off, are still shown as the same night's work. Yorkshire has the Barghest, the northern counties the Padfoot, Wales the Gwilgi, and the Cwn Annwn, hounds of the other world whose cry is loudest when they are furthest away. The accounts barely vary. The animal is larger than a dog has any business being, black, silent, and its eyes are wrong. It turns up where boundaries are, crossroads, parish edges, old roads, churchyard gates. Flame along the coat is the illustrator's addition rather than the folklore's. What the witnesses described was the opposite of fire, a shape darker than the night it stood in. One of these dogs is documented to the point of pedantry. The earliest counts of the heads are not 3. Hesiod gives 50, Pindar 100, and 3 because 3 is what fits on a painted pot without crowding the handles. Vase painters added a serpent for a tail and a mane of snakes along the spine, and the arrangement held. The job is a threshold, and it runs one way. Hesiod is precise about it. The dog fawns on everyone going in and devours anyone attempting to come back out. That is what makes the 12th and last labor of Heracles the strangest of the set. He goes down, takes the animal out through the door alive, and then, alone among the labors, gives it back. Later writers preferred sedation. In the Aeneid, the Sibyl throws a honey-drugged cake, and all 3 heads take it, which leaves English with a sop to Cerberus for a bribe that buys silence. 2 heads asleep, and 1 awake is the same duty drawn as a shift rota. The Greek word underneath all of this was neutral. A daimon was a spirit, a portion, a power attached to a person or a place. Hesiod used it for the guardian spirits of a vanished golden age, and Socrates described his own as a voice that only ever told him what not to do. The narrowing happened in translation, as one culture's word for the divine became another's word for whatever it had displaced. The picture was assembled the same way, out of spare parts from older art. The horns, the shaggy legs, and the cloven feet come from Pan and the satyrs of classical sculpture. The wings were feathered for centuries, and stayed feathered in Byzantine work. Bat wings arrive in Italian painting around the turn of the 14th century, and giottos are among the first that mattered. The reason is compositional rather than doctrinal. Leather reads instantly against feathers, and a painter with a crowded panel needs that difference legible from the far end of the chapel. Size here is a statement about rank rather than anatomy. Medieval painters inherited hierarchical proportion from Egyptian and Byzantine practice, in which the important figure is simply drawn larger than everything else in the same scene. So the heavier build and the branching crown mean seniority, the way a bigger chair does. The horns are borrowed goods. Antlered and horned figures were carved all across pre-Christian Europe, on the Gundestrup cauldron and on Romano-British altars, and later artists picked the shape up as ready-made shorthand for something old and unreconciled. Horns are unstable even in translation. Michelangelo's Moses carries them because a Hebrew word for radiance was rendered into Latin as horned, and generations of sculptors copied the slip in good faith. The motionless sentinel over a gate is architecture's own contribution. Grotesques sat on cathedral parapets for centuries, though the famous brooding pair at Notre Dame are Victorian, designed by Violet Leduc in the 1840s for a building that had managed without them. Above a certain size, the imagery stops describing creatures and starts describing an organization. The catalogs that fix the idea are early modern. Johann Weyer's list of 1577 names 69 spirits with titles lifted straight out of a royal court. Kings, dukes, marquises, and presidents, each commanding a stated number of legions, and the lesser key of Solomon later rounded the roster up to 72. Weyer is worth naming because of his purpose. He was a physician, and the catalog was an appendix to a book arguing that the women being tried in his lifetime were ill or deluded rather than guilty, and that the courts were killing them for nothing. Reginald Scott translated much of it into English in 1584 with the same intention. The lists say more about the bureaucracies that produced them than about anything else. A world organized into chanceries and legions imagines its opposite along identical lines, with a chain of command, and something very large at the top of it. The top of that chain was named by a poet. Archfiend is Milton's, from Paradise Lost in 1667, built on a word already ancient. Fiend comes from Old English fiend, the enemy, formed from a verb meaning to hate, and set in that language directly against friand, formed from a verb meaning to love. Milton supplied the architecture as well. Pandemonium is his coinage, all the demons, a palace thrown up in an hour by a fallen builder, and then used of all things as a debating chamber, with a seated council and points of order. The chains, the throne on its volcanic dais, and the vast smoke-filled hall in later pictures all come downstream of that poem, rather than out of anything older. Illustrators finished the work. Blake, Fuseli, and above all John Martin, whose mezzotints of 1827 gave the hall its impossible scale, settled a formula that painters and later film designers have repeated ever since. Enormous architecture, one seated figure, and the light coming from below. The smoke is the anatomy. In Arabian tradition, the djinn are a separate order of created beings, neither human nor angelic, described as made from a smokeless fire, and the Ifrit is a particularly formidable class among them. Artists who take that description literally give the figure a torso and arms, and let everything below stay a column. The word is older than any surviving definition of it, and its origin is still argued over, with one line tracing it to a root for rolling in dust. Early folklore attached Ifrits to the dead and to the smoke of violence, later to ruins, deserts, and abandoned places, which is where storytellers have gone on putting them. Europe met them through the 1001 Nights, and specifically through Antoine Galland's French translation of the early 18th century, which is also where the pantomime genie comes from. The stage version shrank into a servant. The tradition it was taken from describes something with its own will and its own quarrels. The tradition is emphatic that this is a society and not a swarm. Djinn in the folklore marry, raise children, quarrel over succession, hold different religions, and answer to kings, which makes a court of drifting embers a reasonable reading rather than an embellishment. The storytellers give them tribes, and the tribes have rulers. The most persistent story about that court is a story about binding it. In the legend cycle attached to Solomon, shared across several literatures of the region, the jinn are compelled to labor by the authority of a seal ring, and the disobedient are shut into brass vessels stamped with it and thrown into the sea. A fisherman hauling one up and prizing it open begins one of the best-known tales in the Nights. Painters dressed the court in what was around them. Ottoman and Persian workshops produced portraits of such beings, and the strangest survive in the 15th century black pen albums in Istanbul. Horned, robed, jeweled figures drawn with unsettling care. The comic version came first, and it was the popular one. On the English mystery play stage, this figure was the audience's favorite entrance, coming and going through a hell mouth, a hinged and painted beast's jaw with a fire kept burning inside it. Guild account books record payments for repainting the mouth, and for the man employed to keep that fire alight. The vice character beat him with a wooden dagger and rode off on his back at the end. The animal parts came from the theater and the farmyard rather than anywhere loftier. Cloven hooves, a lashing tail, a goat's shag, and in painting a set of extra faces on the belly and the knees, an old visual joke about dignity turned upside down that bosh, and the Last Judgment painters worked hard. The folk tale version is a bargainer who loses. Across Europe he builds a bridge overnight for the first soul to cross it, and a dog or a goat is sent over first. Dozens of bridges in Wales, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy carry his name still. Even the fork was inherited. Nothing early assigns this figure a trident. 3 prongs belong to sea gods, and the underworld staff in Etruscan tomb painting is a hammer, carried by the blue-skinned, hook-nosed Charon, who is the direct visual ancestor of the medieval tormentor. The pitchfork of later pictures is likelier to be a farm implement, the tool used for pitching things into a fire. Scale did the rest. Milton made the figure monumental, and Gustave Doré, engraving Dante in 1861, made it still. Doré's does nothing whatever. It is vast, wings mantled, fixed at the bottom of the world, and it is that stillness rather than any action which later illustrators copied. Which is where these pictures end. The armored wings fold, the fire along the rampart holds its line, and the figure on the tower only watches. In every tradition that has drawn it, waiting is the part it does best. A city of the dead is a real category of building, usually laid out like one. The Etruscans at Servitory cut streets between round tomb mounds and gave the dead doorways, chambers and furniture carved from the rock. Egyptian burial grounds ran along the west bank, opposite the living town, across water. The Greek word is blunt. The dead get a settlement of their own. Walls made out of tombs are not an invention either. Where consecrated ground ran short, graves were emptied after a few years and the bones stacked as building material. From 1786, the Paris catacombs took the contents of the Holy Innocents Cemetery and arranged 6 million people into walls of femurs faced with courses of skulls. At Sedlec in Bohemia and in the Capuchin crypt in Rome, the same material was worked into decoration, and the intention was devotional rather than macabre. The processional hall follows a real plan. Catacomb galleries ran for miles with bodies shelved into the rock on both sides of a central aisle, and the living walked down them. Outside, the ground is wet. Lights that hover over marshy burial ground have a plain cause in decay and a folk name almost everywhere. In Wales they were corpse candles, and the direction one traveled told the parish whose funeral was coming. Underneath the armor and the rank, everyone in medieval Europe was understood to be carrying the same object. The dance macabre made the point without decoration. Painted on a cemetery wall in Paris in 1424, and copied across Europe for the next 2 centuries, it showed the dead leading the living away in order of precedence. Pope, emperor, bishop, knight, laborer, child, each one paired with a skeleton that mirrors his posture and takes him by the hand. The dead in those pictures are cheerful. They caper, they play instruments, they are the only figures in the scene with any energy in them, and the joke is that they are the same men a little further along. The battlefield version has a physical basis. Cadaveric spasm locks the muscles at the instant of death, and a hand closed on a weapon at that moment stays closed. Excavators find the grip long after everything else about the man has gone, which is why the dead come up out of the mud still holding their own weapons. Armored ranks in the ground are an archaeological fact. After the fighting outside Visby on Gotland in July 1361, the dead were tipped into mass graves without being stripped, because the heat had made the work impossible. Excavation from 1905 recovered more than 1,000 men still wearing mail and coats of plates, laid in courses, still sorted roughly as they had fallen. Toten in 1461 supplies the other half of the picture. The skulls from that grave carry multiple blade wounds to the face and the back of the head, a good many of them delivered after the man had stopped being able to defend himself. Discipline is what the image borrows. A body of infantry that holds its dressing under pressure is doing something learned, and the armies that could do it said so about themselves at every opportunity. Ordered ranks standing silent in a corridor read as menacing for the same reason they read as professional. Nothing about the arrangement is improvised, and none of it depends on the men inside being alive. Medieval Europe had a walking corpse and treated it as a matter of record rather than of story. William of Newburgh, writing in the 1190s, gives 4 cases and apologizes for how many more he could have given. The pattern is consistent. A dead man leaves his grave at night, returns to the house he lived in, and brings sickness with him until the body is dug up and burned. The Icelandic sagas describe the same creature and are more specific about it. The draugr is heavy, solid, and swollen, its skin gone blue-black, and it has to be physically wrestled. It is a corpse doing corpse things, not a spirit. The remedies left evidence in the ground. Burials across medieval Europe have been found with the body weighted under stones, staked through, or decapitated, and the skull moved away from the neck. 2 skeletons excavated at Kiltishin in Ireland had stones wedged into their mouths. Whoever put them, they're expected the mouth to be used again. The word came into English from Haitian Creole, and in Haiti it names something other than what these pictures show. A zombie is a person whose will has been taken. The tradition distinguishes the body without its spirit from the spirit held apart from its body, and in both cases the horror is bondage, not appetite. The fear is of being made to labor without rest or release, on land where labor under those terms was living memory. Vodou is a religion with millions of practitioners, its own clergy and its own funeral rites, several of them meant to keep the dead where they are put. The creature in the picture is a separate lineage. American travel writing carried the word north in the 1920s. Film took it up in the 1930s, and by 1968 it had been fused with the ghoul and with contagion into something that hunts in numbers and spreads by biting. That figure is a century old and belongs to cinema. The word it borrowed is older, and where it came from it describes a person. The name is a false friend. Old English wit meant creature or thing, with no connection to the dead at all, and a wit could be a person, an animal, or an object. The modern sense, a dead thing in a burial mound, was fixed by Tolkien, who built the Barrow-wight out of the Norse hogbuey, the mound dweller who stays where he is and keeps what was buried with him. The grave goods are the real part. Scandinavian mound burials held torques, arm rings, weapons, and horse harness, wealth taken out of circulation and left in the ground, and the sagas keep returning to the man who goes in after it. Grettir breaks into Kar's mound, fights the occupant in the dark, and comes out carrying a sword. Mound breaking happened constantly. Surveys of Scandinavian and Merovingian burials show large numbers opened in antiquity, often within a generation of the funeral, sometimes as a deliberate political act. The chamber here has already been robbed. That was the normal condition of these places. The word arrives in Scots around 1510 and does not mean a ghost. A wraith was the apparition of a person still living, seen somewhere that person was not, and its appearance meant they were about to die. Ireland had the fetch and Germany the doppelganger, and the rule ran the same way in each. The double is not the visitor. The double is the warning. The cold belongs to the wider tradition. Apparitions are reported alongside a drop in temperature so consistently, across so many unconnected places, that the association is a good deal older than any attempt to account for it. What happens over a fresh grave has a folk logic of its own. In parts of Scotland and Scandinavia, the most recently buried person was held to keep watch over the churchyard until the next burial relieved them, which made the order of a bad winter's funerals a matter of local concern. A shape pausing above disturbed earth is doing a recognized job. It is waiting to be replaced. The folk vampire was a neighbor. The cases that put the word into European newspapers came off the Habsburg military frontier in the 1720s and 1730s, where army surgeons were sent to investigate and filed written reports. Petr Blagojevich at Kiselova in 1725, Arnaut Pavel at Medveja 7 years after. In both, a cluster of deaths ran through one village, and the first person to die was blamed for the rest of them. Exhumation confirmed it, because exhumation always does. A body a few weeks in the ground is bloated. Its skin has slipped to expose what looks like fresh skin underneath. The gums have receded so the teeth stand longer, and fluid comes from the mouth when the chest is pressed. Every one of those was read as evidence of feeding. The remedies were physical and much the same across the Slavic and Romanian traditions. Stake the body, take off the head, burn what is left. Nothing in that world involved a mourning coat or a mirror. The creature was a farmer, recently dead, and known to everyone present. The title came out of fiction. A story published in 1819 moved the creature from the village into the drawing room, gave it a peerage and manners, and everything that followed on stage and in print kept the promotion. The crown, the rings, and the ruined banquet hall belonged to that lineage rather than to the folklore underneath it. The bats are a stranger inheritance. European vampire belief had nothing to do with bats. Naturalists working in South America found blood-feeding bats and named them after the folk creature, and the name then traveled back into the story, so that a swarm of bats now signals a vampire because a bat was once named for one. One thing survives it intact. The folk vampire came home. It returned to its own house, its own bed, and its own family, and it killed the people it had loved first, which is why villages dealing with one were digging up their own relatives. A long table set for a household that is no longer there is the oldest part of the picture. This one is honestly modern. The word itself is old. Old English lich meant body or corpse, and it survives in the lich gate, the roofed gate where a coffin waited for the priest, and in the lyquake, the night spent watching over a body before burial. None of those uses involve anything moving. The undying sorcerer who keeps his soul in a container is a product of 20th century fantasy fiction, worked up by pulp writers, and then fixed in the shape seen here by tabletop role-playing in the 1970s, which supplied the robes, the staff, and the vessel. The word chosen for that vessel, phylactery, is the Greek term for tefillin, the prayer boxes worn in Jewish observance, borrowed for its sound and meaning nothing of the kind. What is genuinely old is the idea underneath it. Folktales across Northern Europe and Russia tell of the figure who keeps his death outside his body, and they all end the same way. Somebody finds where it is kept. Koshe the Deathless is the clearest version. His death is not in him. It is in a needle, inside an egg, inside a duck, inside a hare, inside an iron chest buried under an oak on a distant island, and the story is entirely about the journey to that oak. Folklorists catalog the pattern across Northern Europe as the ogre whose heart lies elsewhere, and the arrangement is never a triumph. A man who has done it has exactly one object left in the world that can kill him, and he has to keep it somewhere. The sanctum is furniture from a real trade. Early modern magicians worked from grimoires that gave exact instructions for drawing a circle before summoning anything, and the circle protected the man standing inside it rather than confining what he had called. John Dee kept around 3,000 volumes at Mortlake, one of the largest libraries in England, alongside shelves of specimens and instruments. It was looted while he was abroad. The scholar who plans for everything tends to lose the collection first. Black armor was ordinary. A blackened or russeted finish was applied at the forge, resisted rust, and needed far less upkeep than a polished surface, so plain black harness was what a working soldier could actually afford. Romance did the rest, and the unnamed knight in black arms became a fixture of it. An opponent who will not give a name, met on a road, fought over reasons that stay unexplained. The damned rider is older and better attested. Orderic Vitalis, writing around 1091, has a priest named Walchelin meet a night procession of the dead on a road in Normandy, ranked by station, knights on horseback among them, everyone in torment. The Peterborough chronicler heard black huntsmen on black horses in 1127. Walter Mapp calls the same thing the household of King Herla. Those processions are never aimless. The dead in them are riding out an obligation left unsettled at the end of a life. and a rider halting at a tomb he recognizes has arrived at the part the story is actually about. The procession acquires a leader wherever it gets told. Northern Europe gave the ride to Odin, England to Herla and to Wild Edric in Shropshire, France to Heliquin, Wales to the Hounds of Annwn. The leader is generally somebody who was known in life and is now damned, which is the whole point of naming him. Phantom armies were reported as events rather than as stories. A pamphlet printed in 1643 describes shepherds near Edgehill, watching the battle of the previous autumn fought again in the air above the field, night after night, with colors and drums, and officers sent down from court who claimed to recognize men they had known. Between 1735 and 1745 people at Suter Fell in Cumberland reported a marching host crossing ground no army could have crossed. The details hold steady across the accounts. The host is silent or very nearly so, it repeats itself, and it leaves the ground exactly as it found it. Nothing is trampled, nothing is taken. It goes over the same field again. Dragons were only ever available as bones, and the bones were real enough. Chinese pharmacy sold long gu, dragon bones, ground down into medicine, and they were fossil mammal remains. In 1899, a scholar named Wang Yireng noticed writing scratched onto a batch of them, which is how the oracle bones of the Shang dynasty came to light. Europe hung its dragons up in public. The Lindworm fountain at Klagenfurt was carved in the 1590s, with a head copied from a skull dug out of a nearby quarry, and the skull was a woolly rhinoceros. Bones chained beside the door of Wall Cathedral in Krakow have hung there for centuries, and belong to a whale and a mammoth. In every case the sequence runs the same direction. The skeleton comes first, out of the ground, obviously enormous and obviously not a cow, and the animal gets worked backwards from it. A dragon made of bare bone is not a decayed version of the creature. It is the only version anyone ever had. The reconstructions came next, and they were confident. Ulis Aldrovandi's History of Serpents and Dragons, printed in 1640, illustrates specimens that had been assembled by hand. Dried rays cut and folded into winged bodies, sold across Europe as dragons and basilisks, catalogued without much hesitation as natural history. Athanasius Kircher put dragons into a book about the interior of the earth in 1665, and felt no need to argue for them. Then the animal left the record. As collections were compared and the fakes came apart, dragons dropped out of natural history across the 18th century and were not replaced by anything. Nothing disproved them. They simply stopped being claimed. What was left kept flying. A creature that no longer has to be real can pass over a battlefield without touching it, and the version that lasts longest is always the one nobody is trying to catch. The chasm does the work a moat does, and it does it better because nobody had to dig it. Building inside rock is among the oldest architectural habits there is. In Cappadocia, whole communities cut settlements down into soft volcanic tuff, during Kuyu running to 8 levels and some 85 meters below the surface, around 280 feet, with ventilation shafts, stables, wells, and stone doors rolled shut from the inside. The principle is the same one at work here. A fortress underground needs only one virtue. The approach can be narrowed until it fits a single man, and everything that comes has to come through it. The hall inside is not so much vaulted as left. The ceiling is raw rock, the pillars are worked where the stone allowed working, and the throne is a stalagmite that was already standing when the first mason arrived. Rock-cut architecture reverses the usual order of building. Material is not brought to the site and assembled. It is taken away, and what remains is the room. Below the walls the ledges fall toward water. Caves carry their own populations. Animals that have been down here long enough that pigment and eyes have gone. And the pale things living along an underground river are the beginning of everything else in this place. The name is Greek and unflattering. Trogl is a hole, and the word means, roughly, those who go into holes. Herodotus applies it in the 4th book of his histories to a people of the Libyan interior, hunted in 4-horse chariots by the Garamantes, said to eat snakes and lizards, and to speak a language like no other, screeching in the manner of bats. Later geographers gave a whole stretch of the African coast of the Red Sea the name Troglodytis, and described the herding peoples living along it. Whatever was being reported, the report was of human beings living in rock. The label outlived the accuracy and became a way of saying that somebody lives lower than the person describing them. The eyes are the part the caves take. Animals kept underground long enough lose pigment first and then sight, because an eye is expensive to grow and useless in the dark. Hearing takes over the work. A creature like this places a footfall on wet stone well before anything else knows there is anyone in the passage. The same reports run hotter the further they travel from whoever made them. Classical geography treated distance as license. At the edge of the map, Pliny set down men without mouths who lived on scent, men with their feet turned backwards, and peoples whose entire existence rested on one traveler repeating another. A cave dweller 2 weeks away eats lizards. The same cave dweller, described at 4 removes, walks in fire. There was ground under it. The ancients put the entrances of the underworld where the earth vented sulfur, at Avernus near Cumae, where the fumes were said to kill birds crossing the lake, and among the Solfatara fields that still smoke north of Naples. The posture at the molten seam is what a working relationship with that ground looks like from outside it. Sulfur was cut by hand out of vents like these for centuries, in heat and fumes that shortened everyone who did it, and the men who did it were regarded, by everyone who did not, as a separate kind of person. Hesiod gives the parentage plainly. Thaumas took Electra, a daughter of Ocean, and she bore swift Iris and the well-haired Harpies, Alo and Ocypete, who keep pace with the blasts of the wind and with birds. They begin as weather rather than as monsters, and their names mean storm wind and swift wing. The verb underneath the name is harpazein, to snatch. In Homer, when a person disappears leaving nothing to bury, the Harpies are said to have taken them, and the same phrasing turns up on real grave markers. The story that fixed them belongs to Phineus, a Thracian king and seer who had been blinded and sat at a table he could never eat from. Whenever food was laid out, the Harpies came down, took what they could carry, and fouled the rest. The Argonauts put in on that coast, and 2 of the crew, the winged sons of the north wind, went up after the birds and drove them off, which bought a starving man a meal and bought the expedition a prophecy. The tradition ages them badly. Hesiod's Harpies are fair-haired and fast. 6 centuries later, Virgil, in the 3rd book of the Aeneid, has bird bodies with girls' faces, hooked hands, bellies that foul everything they pass over, and faces permanently pale with hunger. That version is set on the Strophiades, the islands where the chase from Phineus's table had ended, and one of them, Celino, stops shrieking long enough to deliver a curse. The descent continues from there. Dante found a use for them in the 7th circle, nesting in the trees of the suicide wood and feeding on the leaves, and later painters kept the crone and dropped the maiden entirely. None of the sources give them a court or a queen. What the sources consistently give them is a position, a filthy roost out of reach, directly above ground the rest of the story has to cross. The hierarchy on that spire is a later invention. The nest of stolen things is not. The belief here is a real one, very old and much simpler than any creature. A look can do harm. It sits in Mesopotamian incantations. It is argued over by Greek and Roman writers under the names Bascania and Fascinatio, and it is still current from Ireland to Iran to Rajasthan. The mechanism everyone agrees on is envy. Harm arrives through admiration, which makes praise dangerous, and a praised child the most exposed thing in the house. Hence the counterformulas spoken immediately after a compliment, and the habit of spitting, lightly and 3 times, to spoil it. Educated antiquity took it seriously rather than dismissing it. Plutarch gave over an entire dinner-table discussion to whether the eye emits something physical, and Pliny reports, at second hand, families said to kill by glance, and people born with double pupils. The petrified figures are that fear stated at full strength. Not sickness, not soured milk, but a look that stops a person exactly where they were standing. The defense, almost everywhere, is another eye. A glance is answered with an object that stares back, and the same solution surfaces in places with no reason to have borrowed it from one another. Blue and white glass beads are strung on children, horses and lorries across Turkey and the Balkans. The open hand, kamsa or hamsa, with an eye set in the palm, hangs in doorways from Morocco to the Levant. Egyptian wedget amulets, painted eyes on Greek drinking cups, and eyes carved onto the prows of ships from the Aegean to Malta to the South China coast all perform one job, which is to be looking first. Roman boys wore a bulla at the neck until manhood for the same purpose, and the phallic fascinum was hung wherever a household felt exposed. Rank down here is a matter of accumulation. An older eye has simply been looking for longer, and the gallery of stone it presides over is the running record of everything that met it. Hesiod counts 3 Gorgons, Astheno, Uriel and Medusa, daughters of the sea powers Phorcys and Ceta, and notes that only the 3rd of them could be killed. The reason she has a face worth telling a story about arrives much later, with Ovid. A beautiful woman assaulted in Athena's temple by the god of the sea, and punished for it by the goddess, who left the face and turned the hair to serpents. Perseus went out equipped by other people. Winged sandals, a cap that made him invisible, a bag to carry the head in, a curved blade, and a shield polished to a mirror, because the only safe way to look at her was not to. He took the head while she slept. Out of the neck came a winged horse and a grown, armed man. The archaic image deserves one note. Greek art almost never shows a face head-on. The Gorgon is the exception, painted staring straight out of the surface, because the entire point of her is that the image looks back. The head kept working after the killing. Fixed to Athena's shield, the Gorgonion became one of the most reproduced protective images in the Greek world, stamped on coins, painted on shields, molded onto roof tiles, set over doorways and ovens, anywhere a household or a city wanted something at the threshold that could stare. The Temple of Artemis on Corfu carries one across its pediment from around 580 BCE, running, tusked, tongue out. Her blood divided along the same line. Taken from the left side it killed, from the right it raised the dead, and Athena is said to have handed both to the physician Asclepius. The face softens with time. By the 4th century BCE she is being carved as beautiful and merely sorrowful, and the serpentine lower body seen here is later still, no part of the Greek image at all. What survived every revision is the hair, and what the gaze does to whoever meets it. The Cretan story is specific about blame. Minos asked Poseidon for a bull out of the sea to sacrifice, was sent one, and kept it. The god's answer was to make the queen, Pasiphae, desire the animal. Daedalus built her a hollow wooden cow, and the child was named Asterion, the starry one. To hold it, Daedalus built the labyrinth. Athens paid tribute into that building, 7 youths and 7 girls, at intervals the ancient sources cannot agree on. Theseus went in with the rest and came out again because Ariadne had given him a thread. The thread solves a problem people tend to misremember. The classical labyrinth, the figure stamped on the coins of Knossos, has no branches. There is one path, it runs to the center, and no choice is offered anywhere along it. The difficulty was never getting lost on the way in. The axe is the other half. The double blade is on everything Manon, and the name of the building has been argued to come from it for over a century. The palace was eventually found. Arthur Evans began digging at Knossos in 1900 and uncovered a complex of well over 1,000 rooms on several stories, spread across some 20,000 square meters, about 5 acres, with light wells and stairs and corridors folding back on each other. Anyone arriving from a village of 6 houses would have described it much as the story does. The figure carved on these walls outlasted all of it. The same 7-ring design, drawn without lifting the hand, was cut into rock in Galicia and northern Italy, laid out in stones along Baltic shores, cut into turf in English fields, painted in India, and used by the Hopi in Arizona, in periods and places with no plausible line running between them. Around 1,200 it was set into the floor of Chartres Cathedral, nearly 13 meters across, a little over 40 feet. The thing waiting in the middle changes name with every telling. The pattern does not change at all. This one is Persian, and it entered Greek through a named source. Ctesias of Cnidus served as physician at the Achaemenid court around 400 BCE and wrote down what he was told about India. His Marticora, from a Persian phrase meaning man-eater, has the body of a lion and is cinnabar red, with a human face and ears, gray eyes, 3 rows of teeth in each jaw, and a tail ending in a sting. It can also throw spines from that tail at whatever it is chasing, and its voice is said to sound like a trumpet and a pipe played together. Aristotle repeats the account in his Zoology and attributes it carefully to Ctesias without endorsing a word of it. Pliny copies it forward regardless. Pausanias, centuries later, suggested the whole animal was a tiger, described by frightened people and improved in transmission. What is left after that argument is the behavior. A big cat working a ledge, with something on the back of it that no cat has. The name shifts at every stage of the journey. Marticora becomes Manticora, then Manticora, then Mantiger, and each retelling drops a detail and adds one. The 3 rows of teeth fall away. The spines thrown from the tail survive in some bestiaries and vanish from others. Medieval heralds adopted it as a beast of arms and gave it spiral horns nobody had ever mentioned. The variant here is named for the one part that has never in the whole sequence been left out. The sting is what the creature is for. A face that reads as human at the front and a scorpion's tail at the back is not a description of an animal. It is a piece of engineering aimed at a particular fear, which is being addressed by something that then kills. At rest, coiled on the husks of what it has already dealt with, only the tail is still moving. Everything else in that chamber has worked out the distance. The Greek word behind dragon is drakon, tied to a verb for looking hard at something. Before it breathed fire it watched, and its standing job in the older stories is guarding. the sleepless serpent over the golden fleece, Ladon coiled round the apples at the edge of the world, Fafnir lying on gold he murdered his father to get. Fire is not universal in that tradition. The horde very nearly is, and so is the enclosure. Western dragons are kept underground, in barrows, in caves, beneath mountains, in chambers much like this one, on top of metal that does nobody any good where it lies. What the stories describe consistently is vigilance rather than appetite. The animal is not eating the treasure and cannot spend it. It is counting it. The smoke drifting off it while it lies there is the only indication that anything in the room is awake at all. Age is the variable the old poems care about. The dragon in Beowulf has held its barrow for 300 winters before anything happens, and the trouble starts with a single cup lifted by a man who was only sheltering there. The poet is blunt about the arithmetic. The gold did no one any good, and at the end of it the survivors put the whole hoard back into the ground. The word is older than the picture. Old English worm and Old Norse ormur means serpent, and the same term covers a worm turned up in a field and the thing under the mountain. Wings, horns, and 4 legs arrived through art, mostly late, and mostly from the south. What the deepest hall holds is therefore not the largest of these animals but the oldest. It has stopped hunting, stopped flying, and stopped needing to be seen doing either, and the rest of the place arranges itself around that. Timber and earth, not stone. Across Iron Age Europe, the standard fortification was a hill ringed with banks and ditches and topped with a palisade, and there were thousands of them. More than 4,000 recorded in Britain and Ireland alone, from single-ditch enclosures of an acre to the stacked ramparts of Maiden Castle in Dorset. Builders laced the walls with horizontal timbers to stop the earth slumping, a method Caesar described in Gaul and admired for the way it resisted both the ram and fire. Some Scottish examples burned anyway, hot enough to fuse their stone into glass, and nobody has settled whether that was an attack or a right. The heads on the posts are attested too. Greek and Roman writers reported that Gallic warriors kept the skulls of notable enemies and fixed them at the entrance to the house, and excavations in southern Gaul turned up stone pillars cut with niches, skulls still seated in them. Inside, the hall does what the citadel's hall did, but the fire sits in the floor rather than against a wall, and the room belongs to an assembly rather than to a lord. Beyond the ditch the ground is grazed thin and marked with stakes. A place like this exports raiding parties and imports whatever they bring back. The word arrives in writing well before the creature does. Early in the 12th century, the chronicler Orderic Vitalis recorded a spirit called Goblinus troubling the neighborhood of Evreux in Normandy, and from there the name traveled into French and then English. Where it came from before that is unsettled. The usual candidates are the Greek kobolos, a word for a rogue, and for the sprite that keeps him company, and the German kobold, spirit of house and mine, which gave cobalt its name after miners blamed it for ore that poisoned the smelter. What the folklore actually describes is small, nocturnal, and acquisitive. Goblins in the older accounts steal rather than fight. They favor milk and small bright objects, blow out candles, tangle the manes of horses, and shift things about at night. The menace is cumulative rather than immediate. Firelight, bones, and a heap of traded oddments sits closer to the source material than a battle line does. The hoard is the point. Everything in it belonged to somebody else, and most of it is worth nothing. The prefix is a nickname. Hob is a familiar form of Robin, itself a familiar form of Robert, so a hobgoblin was originally the goblin one was on first-name terms with. Gervase of Tilbury, writing around 1211, described the portunes of the English countryside. Tiny, wizened men who worked at night in farmhouses, warmed themselves at the banked fire and asked for nothing but a little food. Robin Goodfellow belongs to the same family. He threshed the corn, and he also led travelers into ditches for the pleasure of it. The word darkened afterwards. Reformers had no patience for household spirits, and by the 17th century a hobgoblin was standing beside foul fiends in devotional verse rather than beside the hearth. The surviving English sense, a hobgoblin as an imaginary fear not worth having, comes out of that demotion. So the bigger, better-armed goblin is a late arrangement. In the folklore, the hob is the one that stayed indoors, and being on friendly terms with it was the entire distinction. The maneuver has a name. Turning in the saddle to shoot backwards over the mount's hindquarters is the Parthian shot, named for the horse archers who destroyed a Roman army at Carrhae in 53 BC by retreating and killing while they retreated. Steppe cavalry used it for the next 15 centuries. It works because a pursuer who is closing cannot also be defending, and because a skirmisher who never stops moving cannot be brought to the kind of fight he would lose. The mount is the part with no historical parallel. Wolves have been raised by hand many times and do not become dogs. A hand-reared wolf attaches to the particular people who reared it and to nobody else, eats more than a household can supply, and grows less biddable rather than more as it matures. Dogs separated from that lineage far enough back to make the difference structural rather than a matter of training, which leaves the moment at the waterhole carrying the weight. Whatever the arrangement is, it is between the two of them. The trophies on the saddle come from a real practice, described by Herodotus in the 5th century BC. Scythian riders, he wrote, took the scalp of every enemy they killed, worked the skin soft, and hung the results from their horses' bridles, the man with the most bridal trophies being reckoned the best among them. Some were sewn together into cloaks. He set it down as an oddity of a people he otherwise admired. Raiding of this sort is an economy rather than a war. Cattle, captives, and portable wealth move from a settled neighbor to a mobile one, and the settled neighbor cannot give chase, because pursuit means leaving the herds unguarded. The Irish epic literature is built around a cattle raid. The Anglo-Scottish border ran on the same arithmetic for 300 years. With families raiding across a line, both crowns had effectively given up policing. The notched post is the other half of the system. A raiding range has to be advertised, since a boundary nobody can read has to be defended in person. This one needs an honest note. There is no deep folk tradition behind the tusked green warrior. The word is genuinely old, but it did not mean this. Beowulf, written down around the turn of the first millennium, lists Orkneys among the monstrous kinds descended from Cain, alongside giants and elves. Nobody is certain what an Orkney was. The usual reading is something like a walking corpse or a hell spirit, and the first element is generally traced to Orcus, a Roman name for the underworld and for the god who held it. From the same root, Italian took Orco, the man-eating giant of its fairy tales. English took orc, which for several centuries meant a large sea monster and nothing else, and which survives in the scientific name of the killer whale. The warrior race is 20th century. It was assembled in fantasy fiction, standardized by tabletop games and fixed by video games into the shape here. Tribal, tusked, painted, organized around raiding. 2,000 years of etymology behind the name, and the thing itself is younger than the aeroplane. Since the creature is modern, the authority it displays has to be borrowed from somewhere, and it has been borrowed accurately. Tacitus, describing the Germanic peoples at the end of the 1st century, separated the king taken for his birth from the war leader taken for his prowess, and noted that the leader commanded less by giving orders than by going first. His following stayed because he fed them, armed them, and won. A chief who stopped winning stopped being followed, and there was no institution underneath him to hold the position up. Anthropologists working in the Pacific found the same arrangement running in living societies and called the holder a big man. Influence is assembled through gifts, feasts, and reputation. It lasts exactly as long as the giving does, and none of it is inheritable. Hence the standard hung with the tusks of rivals. In a system with no office to point at, the evidence has to be carried around. The skull and antler helm is the same argument made in a different material. Same root as the orc, different root. Ogre reached French from Latin orcus by way of Italian orco, and it arrived in print in something close to its present shape in 1697, when Charles Perrault published the collection that fixed several fairy tales in the form still told. His ogres eat children, keep a wife and daughters, own useful property, and are without exception beaten by someone much smaller. One is talked into turning himself into a mouse and eaten by a cat. Another cuts the throats of his own daughters in the dark because a child had swapped their caps. That stupidity is not incidental. Folklorists give the tales a whole class of their own, the stupid ogre, running to some 200 numbered types in which strength is defeated by a trick. The tree trunk club and the crude hillside den belong to the same figure. Enormous, hungry, propertied in a disorganized way, and living off people who cook their food better than it does. The ogre of the tales has no magic. This one is a graft, and the grafted parts are real enough. Bone is the oldest divining material there is. Heating an animal's shoulder blade until it cracks and reading the cracks is attested from Bronze Age China, where the questions and answers were carved onto the bone afterwards and produced the earliest Chinese writing. The practice was still being worked across Mongolia, Siberia, and northern Europe within living memory. A specialist grinding bone and ash over a fire is doing recognizable work. The eye on the brow is a borrowed symbol with an odd biological footnote. It appears in Indian religious art as a mark of inner sight. And separately, the tuatara of New Zealand and several lizards carry a genuine third eye on top of the skull, with lens and retina, most visible in the young, registering light and keeping time rather than seeing. The tattoos are the least exotic element. A 10th century Arab traveler who met Norse merchants on the Volga described them inked from fingertips to neck. The rock is the ruck of Arabic and Persian storytelling, and its best known appearance is in the tale of the merchant marooned on an island, who takes its egg for a white dome and ties himself to the bird's leg with his turban to be carried off. The bird there is large enough to lift an elephant, and it drops boulders on ships out of spite. Marco Polo placed it on Madagascar and reported, in a tone he did not use for everything, that envoys of the Great Khan came back carrying a ruck feather. The likeliest object is a frond of the raffia palm, which grows leaves 20 meters long and looks, closed, like a quill. Madagascar supplied a better candidate too. The elephant bird stood 3 meters tall, weighed as much as half a ton, and laid eggs a foot long, holding the contents of 150 hens' eggs. It could not fly, and went extinct within roughly the last 1,000 years, recent enough that traders were still turning up the shells on beaches. The second great bird belongs to a different part of the world and to a different kind of source, and the difference is worth stating plainly. There is no single thunderbird. Powerful thunder beings appear in the traditions of many indigenous nations across North America, under their own names and inside their own stories. And those nations are distinct peoples. The Anishinaabe, the Lakota Wakinian, and the Thunderbird carved on the northwest coast are not three versions of one figure. Several accounts do share a shape, a great bird of the upper world whose wing beats make thunder, and whose eyes or whose flight make lightning, standing in long-settled opposition to a powerful being of the waters below. Among New Chanolf traditions, it hunts whales. On the northwest coast, it is carved on poles and house fronts by the families entitled to carry it. These are held stories, told by particular people at particular times, and they belong to those communities in the present tense. The carving below a roosting bird records a relationship, and the relationship did not end. Greek and unusually well documented. Hesiod gives three cyclopes, bronze, steropes and arges, thunder and lightning and brightness, born of sky and earth and set to work at the forge, where they made the thunderbolt. Homer gives something else entirely. A race of one-eyed herdsmen on a fertile island who plant nothing, hold no assemblies, and each rule their own household without reference to anybody. The best known of them keeps sheep and goats in a cave, milks them at evening, curdles the milk, and stacks the cheeses in baskets. The story turns on hospitality violated and answered with a trick. Blinded with a sharpened olive stake while drunk, he is told his attacker's name is nobody, so his neighbors ignore the shouting, and the men escape lashed beneath the bellies of his own rams. He throws boulders after their ship from memory, aiming at the sound. Later Greeks credited the Cyclopes with the vast, unmortared walls at Mycenae and Turins, on the reasoning that nothing human had shifted blocks that size. The masonry is still called Cyclopean. A king is the one thing the source material rules out. Homer is specific that these creatures hold no assemblies and keep no laws, that each lays down the rule for his own wife and children, and pays no attention to the next. And the whole point of the episode is a society that cannot organize itself even to help a neighbor who is screaming. An iron crown and a court receiving tribute would have read to the poet as the joke. The other tradition supplies the throne room instead. The forged cyclopes work in company under a master smith, and Roman poets put them in a cavern beneath Etna, hammering out thunderbolts and armor to order, which is a workshop with a hierarchy inside it. One explanation for the single eye keeps resurfacing. The Mediterranean islands held dwarf elephants, and a dwarf elephant skull found in a cave carries a nasal cavity in the middle of the forehead, wide enough to read as a socket. The proposal cannot be tested, and is very hard to forget. The name is a real word with a traceable history. Hebrew behema means a beast, an animal of the herd, and behemoth is its plural, read as an intensive, the beast of beasts. It appears in a long speech in the book of Job, where the creature is set out in detail. It eats grass like an ox. Its strength is in its loins. It lies under the lotus among the marsh reeds. Its bones are described as tubes of bronze, and a river in flood does not trouble it. Commentators have argued the identification for 2,000 years without settling it. The grazing, the marsh, and the bulk point toward a hippopotamus. The tail compared to a cedar does not. Others read it as a primeval creature of the land, paired with a creature of the sea a few lines on, one for each half of the world, and not an animal anybody could go and look at. From there, the word passed into English as a common noun. A behemoth is now anything too large to argue with. Age is the only element added here, and age is what the original passage was already about. The The speech and job produces the creature as an argument from scale. It was made first. It cannot be captured or led away with a rope, and the fitting response to it is to stop talking. Later commentary paired it permanently with the sea creature described alongside it, and left the two of them apart and waiting. The lichen is a real clock. Crusts of it grow slowly enough and steadily enough that geologists use them to date the exposure of rock surfaces, a few centimeters in a century for some species, which makes a covering of this kind a claim about how long a thing has stood still. The goods heaped at the feet need no explanation. Whether it is worship, insurance, or apology, leaving something at the edge of a power too large to fight is documented wherever people have lived beside one, and the leaving tends to outlast any account of why. Wet ground defends itself. A wall on a hill has to be raised high enough to matter. A wall on a marsh only has to sit behind water deep enough to stop a siege engine and soft enough to swallow one. Almost everything a besieging army depends on fails below the water table. Carts bog down, towers sink, and a tunnel dug under a foundation fills before it reaches it. The causeway of half-sunk logs is the entire argument. It is the only firm approach. It is narrow, and it can be cut. People have built this way for a very long time. Timber trackways laid across the Somerset marshes date to around 380 BC. In Ireland and Scotland, families raised crannogs, artificial islands of stone and brushwood reached by a single submerged walkway, and some were still in use in the 17th century. In the marshes of southern Iraq, halls the length of a church were built entirely from bundled reeds, arched and lashed without a nail in them. The materials here follow the same logic. River mud plastered over reed bundles, brick dried where it was laid, bone where a builder on firmer ground would use timber. Nothing is quarried and nothing is carted in. The marsh supplies the walls, the roof, and the moat together. This one is worth being honest about. It has no deep folklore behind it. The word appears to enter English with Lord Dunsany, whose 1912 story sent a burglar to steal from the gnolls in their wood. Dunsany never described what a gnoll looked like. The hyena's head was attached decades later by fantasy gaming, which fixed the composite in its present shape. The older material is in the animal itself. Across a range of African traditions, the hyena is not simply a scavenger, but a creature associated with hostile magic. A witch's mount, sometimes a shape a person is said to take at night. The specifics differ sharply from region to region, but the association is broad and old. Some of it the animal has earned. Spotted hyenas hunt far more than they scavenge, live in clans led by females, and crack open bone that other predators abandon. The laugh is real, and it means close to the opposite of amusement. It is the sound a hyena makes while losing a fight over a carcass. The escalation is social rather than personal. A spotted hyena's whoop carries something like 5 kilometers, 3 miles, across open ground, and it works as a summons. It identifies the individual calling and brings the clan in. What arrives is not a company of equals. Rank is inherited, largely through the mother, and a grown, low-born male eats after the youngest daughter of the ranking female. Numbers are the whole tactic. A clan that mobs a carcass will take it off lions if it can bring enough bodies to the argument, and the noise on the way in is part of the method. The shrieking builds as the group commits, and is how the group knows it has. The trophies follow from the same habit. A settled army takes ground and holds it. A raiding one takes what can be carried and then displays it. Skulls, plates of bone, another people's banner pulled down and driven into the mud. It is a portable record of who won. kept that way because there is no wall to carve it on. Reptilian people are among the most widely distributed figures in world folklore, and that distribution is the interesting fact about them. Serpent-bodied Naga across South and Southeast Asia, dragon kings holding court beneath rivers in China, scaled water spirits in West Africa, and in the Americas. These traditions did not borrow the idea from one another. They arrived at it separately, and they mostly arrived at it near water. Clay figurines with long, lizard-like heads were shaped in southern Mesopotamia some 7,000 years ago. What they were meant to represent is unknown, and any confident answer about them is a guess in better clothing. The equipment is not a guess. A shield cut from a turtle's shell, a spear shafted with reed, and the patience to stand chest-deep and wait. This is the kit of nearly every marsh-dwelling people that ever had to hold a wetland. Ambush is the only sensible tactic on ground where an attacker cannot see the bottom, and a defender already knows where it is firm. The upgrade is in the edge. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and a freshly struck flake ends in a blade a few molecules thick, finer than any steel that has ever been ground. Surgeons still use obsidian scalpels for work where the scar matters. Mesoamerican armies set rows of such flakes into wooden swords and produced a weapon that opened a man to the bone in one draw. What glass will not do is last. It chips against armor and shatters on stone, so a warrior carrying it carries spares and expects to re-edge between fights, which turns a weapon into a supply problem. Because obsidian comes out of particular volcanoes, and each flow carries its own chemical signature, a single flake can be traced back to the mountain it was struck from. Flakes turn up hundreds of kilometers from any source. That means trade, and trade means the totem at the edge of the camp marks a people with neighbors, obligations, and a route to the high ground where the glass is. Winged serpents are better attested in the ancient record than most monsters. Herodotus reported them in Arabia, guarding the frankincense trees, and claimed to have visited a place in Egypt where their bones lay in drifts. He was almost certainly looking at something else. The image was not his invention, though. Egyptian art gave the cobra wings on temple ceilings and coffin lids, and the Hebrew seraph, a word built on burning, was a fiery flying serpent long before it became a rank of angel. There is even an animal behind it. Several species of tree snake in Southeast Asia genuinely leave a branch and cross open air, flattening the body into a shallow ribbon and swimming sideways as they fall. It is a controlled glide rather than true flight, but the snake lands roughly where it intended to. The rest is small, quick, and built for ambush from above. It waits over still water, strikes downward once, and folds its wings hard against its own body on the way down so that nothing slows the fall. The second pair of wings changes what the animal can do. A dragonfly drives all four independently, which is why it can hover, slide sideways, stop dead in the air, and turn without banking into the turn. Insects built on the same plan were flying 300 million years ago, before there were reptiles to be modeled on, some of them with wingspans near 70 centimeters, more than 2 feet. The hunting is the remarkable part. A dragonfly does not chase. It works out where the target is going to be, flies to that point, and corrects as it closes, and it succeeds on something close to 19 attempts out of 20. No large predator comes near that rate. Human observers read the same animal as menace or as virtue, depending on where they stood. English country names put it in bad company, the devil's darning needle. Japanese warriors called it the victory insect and wore it on helmet and armor, in the belief that it only ever moves forward. This one comes with a source. Pliny the Elder set it down in the 1st century. A small serpent out of Cyrenaica, no more than a foot long, marked on the head with a white crown. That mark is where the name comes from, Basiliskos, the little king. Pliny's basilisk travels with the front of its body raised instead of crawling flat, scorches the grass it passes over, splits rock, and kills at a distance. Venom running back up, a spear was said to have killed the horseman who used it. The single weakness in the account is its strangest detail. The basilisk's enemy is the weasel, dropped into the hole after it. The weasel kills the thing and dies of the encounter. And medieval bestiaries copied that forward for 1,000 years without once asking why. A cobra rears, spreads a hood marked like a crown, and spits venom toward the eyes. The animal that goes down the hole after a cobra is a mongoose. The petrifying stare was added later, by people standing much further from the animal. The creature grew in transmission. Pliny's foot-long snake passed through 1,000 years of copyists, and emerged as a crested quadruped with a cockerel's body and a serpent's tail. The cockatrice, hatched according to the recipe from an egg laid by an old rooster and brooded by a toad. Nobody had witnessed this. Each copyist added rather than subtracted, which is how bestiaries work. The defenses grew alongside it. A mirror held up would turn the gaze back and destroy the thing with its own weapon. The crow of a cockerel killed it outright. A weasel remained reliable. The story stayed practical. In 1587, the people of Warsaw were said to have lost 2 girls in a cellar, and to have sent a condemned man down in a suit of mirrors to deal with whatever was living there. A sealed cellar can fill with air that carries no oxygen, kills quietly, and leaves the body unmarked. No one in 1587 had a name for that, and a monster was the available explanation. 2 separate traditions meet in this animal, and they are worth keeping apart. Gorgon in Greek is a category rather than a name. 3 sisters held it, Esthene, Uriel, and Medusa, daughters of 2 sea deities, and of the 3 only Medusa could die. She is the one killed in the famous story. Her 2 sisters cannot be, and they carry on after it ends. What stands here is the category itself, or one of the 2 immortal sisters. The mortal one is a different creature, and is counted elsewhere in this bestiary. The 4 legs and the horned head arrive from somewhere else entirely. Pliny and Aelian both describe an animal in Ethiopia called the catapulpas. Heavy bull-like, its head so weighted that it hangs toward the ground, killing whatever meets its eyes when it lifts them. By 1607, an English compiler had merged that beast with the Greek sisters and printed the result under the name Gorgon. The mane of serpents belongs to the older strand, and long predates the beautiful face that later art gave her. An older use explains the posture. Before the Gorgon was a story, she was a face, carved and painted and set where people had to walk past it. On shield bosses over doorways, on the pediment of the Temple of Artemis on Corfu around 580 BC, where the head stands roughly 3 meters, 10 feet, above the entrance. Bakers stamped it onto ovens. The face was never meant to be attractive. Bulging eyes, boar's tusks, a tongue pushed out between them, a grimace built to be met head-on. Being seen was the entire function. Anything arriving with hostile intent was supposed to look up, meet the stare, and stop where it stood. That is a defensive weapon and nothing else. It works on the approach and only on the approach. It cannot pursue, and it cannot be carried to somebody else's gate. A heavy animal standing at the head of a causeway among the gray figures of everyone who came anyway is doing the work of an ornament that was always meant literally. The distinction is in the legs, and it matters. A wyvern has two, and it stands on them. Its wings are its forelimbs, the way a bird's or a bat's are, so there is nothing left over to walk on. The Western dragon of later convention has 4 legs and a separate pair of wings, 6 limbs in total, an arrangement no vertebrate has ever possessed. The name gives away the origin. It comes through Old French from vipera, the viper. This began as a snake, acquired wings, and kept its venom, which is what the barb on the end of the tail is still doing. Heralds turned the difference into a rule and enforced it far more strictly than medieval artists ever had. In church carvings and manuscript borders, the number of legs tends to be whatever fits the space available. Once codified, though, the wyvern held. It flew as a standard in Wessex. It sits in the arms of English families and towns, and it has outlasted nearly everything it was first drawn beside. The crest is a claim. In heraldry, a crown or coronet added to a beast marks it as belonging to a particular rank, and the difference between 2 otherwise identical charges may be nothing but that band of gold. The whole system exists so that such a claim can be checked by anyone who knows how to read it. The body plan explains the rest. 2 legs and 2 wings is the arrangement birds use, and it produces a specific way of living, clumsy on the ground, superb above it. An animal built this way takes a high perch, holds a territory wide enough to see across, and converts height into speed when it commits, folding the wings and letting the dive do the work. The stinger changes the ending. A falcon has to strike accurately enough to kill on impact. A venomous animal does not. It needs one clean contact and then the patience to follow whatever runs, which is the cheaper method, and across a swamp this size, the more reliable one. Lerna was a real place before it was a monster. It lies on the coast of the Argolid, a marsh where springs rise straight up out of the ground, and the Greeks took it for one of the entrances to the underworld. The name of the creature is simply their word for water. It was the second of Heracles' 12 labors and the one he came nearest to losing. Cutting off a head produced 2 in its place. The answer was not strength. His nephew Iolaus followed him with a burning brand and seared each stump the instant it was opened. And the final head, the one that could not be killed at all, went under a rock. Ancient writers never agreed on how many heads there were. Hesiod does not count them. Later authors give 9, or 50, or 100, and vase painters drew as many as the pot had room for. Heracles dipped his arrows in the blood on the way out. That poison outlived the labor, and in the end it killed him. Regeneration is not the invention it appears to be. In the 1740s, a Swiss tutor named Abraham Tremblay found a small green polyp in a ditch, cut it in half to settle whether it was plant or animal, and watched both halves become whole animals. He kept cutting. Splitting the head end lengthwise, again and again, produced a 7-headed specimen. Naturalists named the creature Hydra after the thing in the myth, and it has since been found to rebuild itself so completely that it shows no measurable sign of aging. The frenzy is observed too. Snakes born with 2 heads, which happens rarely but reliably, do not cooperate. Each head hunts on its own account, both compete for the same food, and they will strike at one another over it, because there is one body between them and no mechanism for settling which head is driving it. Multiplied by 7, the effect is legible enough. More heads is not more monster, it is more argument.